Hello everyone. So I see that I'm delivering the last PowerPoint presentation for the day. And Brenda and Nathaniel, I have to thank you guys for setting me up really well for my topic, because I am going to be picking up on this issue of access. And my presentation was motivated by two factors that I do want to outline right away. The first one is that our students have really embraced new media technologies. And I'm specifically going to focus on the internet here. And the other thing is that as instructors, as educators, a lot of our pedagogies are also internet-based. And I want to talk about some of the issues that might crop up with this enthusiastic embrace of these technologies. So early talks about, in the internet has been very techno-utopian. It's a raceless space. It's going to make everyone equal. But this has really not been true, and just a very cursory look at some statistics will show you this. So top 10 countries in terms of internet users, these are mostly European or generally Western countries. And if you're wondering, the United States actually comes in at 77%, and India, which is my home country, comes in at 10%. So there's something going on here. Lowest 10 countries are all in the so-called global south. And if you visualize this in a more dramatic manner, this is how the map of the world would look if we look at it purely in terms of internet users in the world. So there is a very dramatic difference. Entire continents are vanishing here. Africa is underrepresented. Latin America is underrepresented. So what does this do to the kind of knowledge that's created? Now, of course, these issues are also occurring within developed countries. So this is not just a problem in the global south. In the US, for instance, there are differences in internet access based on factors like race, age, income, education, and I highly recommend this national broadband map, and this was a website that came up very recently, and you can tailor its facets to figure out, what are these differences that are affecting internet access. So very glaring differences in access, and what I want to say, what I argue for, is that these differences have an impact on who can produce knowledge, who can share knowledge, what kinds of topics are being discussed, and how these topics are being discussed. And we need to care about this as educators, but also as users of these technologies. So for those of you who are digital humanists here, you will see that this is a very familiar map. All of the D8 centers are emerging in these very elite, liberal Western institutions, underrepresented in many continents. And this is doing something to the kind of knowledge that is being created. In terms of pedagogy, think about Wikipedia. We often send our students to Wikipedia, or our students use Wikipedia. But look at some of these statistics that are coming out of their own users, so their own editor surveys. So 76% of editors make edits to the English version of Wikipedia. So what's happening with the other versions, the other language versions? What kind of edits are being made to these versions? Or gender inequalities, 8.5% of Wikipedia editors are female. I mean, talk about underrepresentation. This is a big difference. And there are also issues with diversity and representation, and this is partially because of notability. You can't just go to Wikipedia and create an article that you want to. You have to first show that the topic is notable, and you do that by sharing citations. So you say, okay, I want to write about this figure. Here are the sources that talk about this figure. But what happens if your sources are not in English? Or if your sources cannot be found on the internet? How do you share with this community that you have a topic that's notable, and it's a topic that other people can verify? So this raises concerns, because let's say as a literature person, if I Google Kenyan literature, I get an entry that's very short on Wikipedia. But if I Google, say, Canadian literature, suddenly the entry improves in content, it improves in both quality as well as quantity. So these differences are important because our students are using these sites. Or social media. Another very big issue, our students love using these different sites. You have Twitter, Facebook, Imgur, Tumblr, all of these different things. But these are social institutions. and they reflect certain biases, prejudices, social structures within different societies. And this was very apparent very recently if you were following what happened after the Boston blasts, where there was this crowdsourced hunt for suspects. And initially they ended up narrowing down on a dark-skinned person. So why was that happening? Well, they were reflecting contemporary American cultural politics. They were reflecting the mainstream news media. So these sites are not as emancipatory, they are not as liberatory as we want them to be, but still our students are using them, we are going through them, we are incorporating them in our work, in our pedagogy, and I think we should be careful about that. So in terms of pedagogy, I think two things that I should mention right away. One, that we are already teaching our students to be critical. And we do this in different ways, in the context of our discipline. We might tell them to be critical about print media, or about cultural geography, history, politics. So we are already doing this, but I don't think we are doing this sufficiently in the context of new media. And the other thing is that our students are going to be using these new media. They're in fact born into them. Some of them are digital natives. But does that mean that they are engaging with them critically? And if they are not doing that, then what can we do about it as educators? So I think the answer to these questions will differ depending on the disciplines we are in. We already saw some examples that Brenda and Nathaniel gave us. So I want to just kind of set out some pedagogical goals that perhaps we can think about in terms of these issues. And of course, this will change. You might tweak it differently based on what discipline you're coming from. So Adam Banks has a very good piece on access, race, rhetoric, and technology. That's his book. And he sets out these 4 levels of access. And he argues that so far, we have only been talking about the digital divide in terms of material and functional access. But it's really insufficient to just give people a computer and say, okay, now you're free. You can do amazing things with this. Or it's not sufficient to say, here's how you can use Word and PowerPoint, and then expect people to do something amazing with it. Instead, we need to be talking about experiential access. So, talking about these new technologies where we can actually experience things. And secondly, in terms of experiential access, we need to have people engaging with these technologies, creating them. They have to talk about policy and regulation. We can't just drop technologies on people and say, okay, now go use this. This is going to be very cool. They have to be involved in creating it. And finally, critical access, which is the most important thing that Adam Banks talks about. And he says, this means that our students need to understand that there are benefits as well as problems with the media they are using. So essentially what our students have to be doing finally is talking about critique, use, and design. Critiquing technologies, being able to resist them when necessary, designing technologies for their own use, retooling them for their own use, reimagining them for their own use, and then transforming those technologies in some way that will transform their own lives. So it's a very lofty goal, and I'm not entirely sure how you would go about doing this. But there are some things that we can think about. So apart from these projects we've heard about, if you're interested in doing, for instance, digital assignments, you might take a look at Rewrite Wikipedia. And this is actually a feminist global project that's unfolding tomorrow. So it's very timely, it just happened to be tomorrow. And basically, they are going to be rewriting Wikipedia entries, adding to Wikipedia, and writing about women all over the world, basically. So it's adding this kind of information so students can engage with it. And of course, if you do assignments like that, you can talk to students about, why are these pieces missing in the first place? Why is that happening? Or you can do things with archives, blogs, websites. So there's a lot of potential with these technologies, and I don't intend to say that these are all bad, but we need to be very careful about how we are embracing them and what we can do with these technologies. Or something like visualizing. I think you have a lot of rich data just with the maps that I showed you earlier that can help spark these conversations with students about what's going on with this data. Why do we have these imbalances in access? What are they reflecting socially and culturally, racially, things like that? So I hope that in our breakout session, perhaps we can have some interdisciplinary brainstorming because I do think that we are doing this kind of critical engagement. We're already helping students develop this skill. The question for me is, how do we do this in the context of new media? Thank you.
We will now go into our breakouts. There's tables 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm probably not pointing to the right tables. So go to the breakout tables and you can meet with the presenters.